Great, thanks anyone for tuning in or watching on YouTube after I put up this video. I've just been having an itch lately to do some more world building, not on my main world of Weirun, where most of my stream games take place, but for something new and kind of starting out in a system agnostic way. Although I suspect that playing games in this new world eventually will most likely happen with Cypher system, because I think it's the most flexible to sort of accommodate this, and because it's a generic play system, it doesn't really bring any baggage in with it. One of the things that I wanted to avoid and was starting with a really blank canvas was all the stuff that kind of comes in with Dungeons and Dragons or other games like that, that really shapes player expectations about the world or the things that they want to play. In particular, the things like, races and what races are available and things like that. And while, yes, you can, in your homebrew worlds, just tell people, you can only play humans, or there's no elves, or, there's only what's in the player's handbook and nothing else, then you're saying no a lot to your players and the ideas that they're coming in with. And, I think it just sort of violates some of the assumptions. And certainly I've had the experience of building worlds where I wanted a really particular theme. I wanted things to be a bit different. I wanted my own spin on the different races and things like that, and I didn't want it to feel quite as standard D&D or standard Fantasyland-ish as often those games do. And, pretty quickly it kind of goes that way, especially when you end up with bigger games. It's hard to sort of, enforce that shared rule set sometimes, I find, using something like D&D versus a system that doesn't have a lot of those assumptions built into it. So we're going to create something totally new and totally fresh. And so one of the things that I want to lay out first is, I think what we'll call principles. The setting. This title. Do it with just heading 1. Okay, so the idea with setting up our principles right off the get-go is sort of like a design guide. So if you're familiar with games sort of like Microscope, this would be sort of equivalent to setting up the palette, your list of yes and no's, things that can or can't be in the game, sort of the general rules that we're going to follow, the theme and tone of the setting, and because this will be important to guide everything later on. And it's not that this can't be changed. We can come back and change this, but we want to get sort of at least our rough thoughts down to start. So let's just make this as a list. Some bullet points. Everybody likes bullet points. All right. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's right. Jonathan in chat. Microscope is a very useful tool. I had an idea about doing a stream using Microscope, and to set up a campaign world for the stream. But I've been itching to do some design on my own, and I didn't want to wait and organize that. But I think I'm still going to do that, and I think that's awesome for your West Marches of Thule to use that. I think it's just such a great way to have everyone who's really like your main players or whatever to have been involved in the creation from the start, and to like all have that buy-in. And so you're designing something right from the get-go, or I think everyone's had their input, and something like the palette, you can really lay out, you know, the do's and don'ts of the world. So that's kind of what I'm going to do here with the principles of the setting, essentially. So all right, the first one right off the bat: no generic or standard fantasy races slash species, because I always hate the term race in here anyway. But that's what we get and what we have the holdover for. So no elves, no dwarves, no halflings, hobbits, gnomes, you know, dragonborn, blah 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 blah. We might end up with races that take some inspiration from those, but we're not going to call them dwarves and elves at the very least. And we do want them to be at least somewhat distinct, right? So, you know, a good example would be the various Tist species in Steven Erikson's Malazan books, right? The Tist kind of remind you of elves. They have a vaguely elf-like quality to them, but they're definitely not, you know, standard fantasy elves in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, the same goes for a lot of similar things. And, you know, Steven Erikson created that world with his friend Ian Esselmont out of GURPS. And so that was born out of, you know, fantasy role-playing, but it ended up being really unique. So that's going to be our first bit, is we don't want any generic or standard fantasy races or species. Like a lot of campaign worlds, I think we were going to have a vague theme of civilization reached greater heights in the past. So this is covering after a fallen empire of some kind. This is, you know, kind of standard in a lot of fantasy tropes, obviously. I think it gives a lot of rich resources for exploration, because this is how we get our dungeons and ruins and things like that, is there was at least one great empire at some point in the past, you know, distant or more recent, that created those and left them behind, and civilization now is but a pale echo of what it once was. Let's put that down. Pale echo of what came before. Okay. The other thing is focus on a single region that reflects the world of classical antiquity in many ways, and more modern periods in others. We'll build on that in a little bit. But the main idea here, as we'll see when we get to doing some mapping, i.e. focus is on a region that draws heavily on the Aegean. That's what I'm using for my inspiration. So there will also, I'll have to be able to spell Aegean. There will also be, you know, some things to do with like Greco-Roman culture in a way, you know, but that will probably mostly be aesthetics more than anything. But the topography that I imagine, much like how the world of Wayrune that I stream in draws heavily on the Mediterranean as a whole, this is going to be much more focused, where what I designed to start with is going to be something kind of like the Aegean, where we've got a sea, it maybe opens up onto a larger sea or ocean, lots of islands, land all around, that sort of thing. But I also, yeah, I know I am, Jonathan. I knew you would like this. And in particular, I think you will like this next bit, that I will also put down, which is that the world and its magic is treated like the highest of sciences and philosophy. And in this sense, science is philosophy. So we're going to draw pretty heavily on the philosophy of classical antiquity in lots of ways. And, you know, we might change that, right? Take some more modern things and take it back and blend it and do all kinds of mixing. We're not just going to steal. We're going to steal selectively and throw everything into a blender. But in particular, I want the feel of magic in this world to be like a science, but like a science in the sense of the classical philosophy. So think metaphysics as opposed to just physics. And that's how practitioners are going to think about that. For anyone who has read R. Scott Baker, who is a great, I believe, Canadian author, who was pursuing a PhD in philosophy at one point before he started writing novels. He has some great novels that I like a lot that reflect this in that regard, where the sorcerers of the world are very rooted, and actually all of his stuff is very rooted in actual metaphysics and philosophical arguments. You know, with for instance, there are the most powerful of the sorcerers in some ways that have the gnosis, and they have very abstract magic that is rooted in sort of the building of theorems and working with the world kind of directly. And then there's the sorcerers who have the anagnosis, who do everything by analogy. And so, for instance, the difference would be when Gnostic sorcerers cast something like, say, destructive magic that, you know, creates fire. They create the abstract ideal of fire. And so, you know, their sorceries will often look like weird, abstract, intersecting planes of like light and heat in a very classical, philosophical, like Aristotelian type way. Whereas anagnostic sorcerers, by analogy, will, you know, create something that looks like a giant dragon's head that breathes flame, right? So those will be like the two competing approaches to philosophy, by analogy versus the sort of underlying logic, with the implication that Gnostic sorcery is actually far more powerful and can do far more things because people know more. So we'll have that. There is inherent tension between religion / religious power and magic. All right, so something that I don't often do in many of my universes and games is I'm going to play heavily on some underlying tensions between religion and sorcery or magic. With I think the implication that sorcery is seen as a foul practice, barely tolerated, perhaps only tolerated due to its sheer power. So kind of riffing off that would be something like temporal authorities make use of sorcerers, which gives them some measure of protection. Maybe under the same sort of heading would be that religious authorities do not have much official temporal power. So like the really, it's not a theocracy. The religious powers that be don't rule the setting or the kingdoms or anything like that. But they've got a lot of authority due to, deep-rooted beliefs of the people. Common folk tend to be very religious and view sorcery with suspicion. All right, so the common people are going to be quite religious. So we'll have this tension as like a class thing as well that will probably be reflected in many ways. Let's see, the region is a maze of city-states and small kingdoms, sometimes united/conquered into powerful but usually short-lived confederacies, hegemonies, etc. And the region is a patchwork of tribal/ethnic identities and cultures, but with lots of mixing. So stemming from that, mostly human, but we should have at least one, perhaps two non-human sentient species. One or more of these may be related to humans in some way. This could be evolutionarily or magically in some way. So we'll see how that plays out as we get sort of deeper in. I've got a rough idea for one. Blue humans. Thanks, Max. Yeah, we could have blue humans, the Blumans. Sort of people may be familiar. I like sort of the idea of, some species that's a lot like traditional interpretations of giants and things like that. I think those are pretty rich areas of mythology to plunder. And it's easy to relate that to things that have happened in the real world. So like Neanderthals. So I'm sort of imagining a period of time where some ancient cousin species of modern humans that's pretty close, likely capable of interbreeding, still exists. It maybe has been pushed to the fringes. And I actually like that because then we can start playing with some ideas around ethnicity and, identity and, acceptance or non-acceptance in the world. So maybe they've been pushed to the fringes as humans have sort of come to dominate and expand. And, that offers us a pretty rich tapestry to draw on, things obviously like the real world and things that have happened. But hopefully to, do it in a way that is respectful and not too stereotypical. So there's that. All right, so I think that we want to sources. Oh, can I not do that live? Must be able to. Let's check. I want that off. Turn that on. All right. There we go. So Campaign Cartographer 3, we'll bring that up. And see what we can do. I wanted to do a new map just so we can show kind of going through it. I have all my alerts here on things. Doesn't bother me with interruptions. No, we won't save that. Okay, so we want to do an overland map. And the question is, because I have bought some different things on Campaign Cartographer, what? Oh, I guess you can't see that on stream. So I've got the 13th Age style Ancient Realms, which is pretty good. That's what I did my Wayrune map in. Classic Fantasy, that might be interesting. Herwin Waylink, no. Local area, no. We're going to be a bigger. Overland Satellite, no. I want something a bit different, no. There's the Mike Shea Ink, so like a black and white. And the other Mike Shea Overland Hex, Overland Vector, Standard. I think that I'm going to go with the Classic Fantasy, which gives us that yellowy appearance. So creating new maps in Campaign Cartographer, we're going to do 1,000 by 800, so that'll be in miles. That's kind of the standard, and it works out that that's actually pretty much the same as the Aegean. So when I've compared that before in the past, parchment background, yes, finish, new, save, create, okay. All right, so there we go. Oh yeah, the darkness that comes before. Yes, excellent. I won't spoil too much. That book hooked me, Jonathan, like almost nothing I had ever read before. And I think you're really going to like it. The philosophy is super deep and heavy, and it comes, it's coming from someone who, I think he maybe went back and finished. I think he actually finally finished a dissertation and submitted it. So whether he actually has his PhD or not, I forget, but Baker basically does have a PhD, level understanding of like classic continental philosophy, and he's really into neuroscience, so it's a real heavy on consciousness and awareness and all kinds of crazy metaphysics that just build up more and more layers as the books go on. So it's pretty awesome. All right. So we have our map here to start, and I am not super great at Campaign Cartography, but I'll see what we can do to get something rough out. This will probably need a lot of work later on to like edit, especially islands and things like that. Making coastlines can be difficult, but let's see what we can do. All right, so I want something. So the great thing with Campaign Cartographer, for those of you who haven't used it before, is it draws fractal lines when we do this coastline. Now we can give this more or less detail by zooming in, and I really wish that there was, and maybe there is, like a tablet interface for this. Because the one thing with like clicking is especially making some of those like ragged coastlines, you know, edges like you would see in like Scandinavia or you see in parts of Greece, tends to be really difficult. But I'm hoping to give this lots of sort of bays and inlets and things like that. And I'm not going to shape it like the actual Aegean. Some smoother. And again, I can already see I'm probably going to have to redraw this at some point. And I'm periodically going to go outside the map and come back in with land, because that will show us that there is other things like the water out there. We don't have any of the details. And so I put that narrow channel in opening. And the great thing is, so down here in the lower right, you know, we can flesh that out later. Does that open out into an ocean? Does it open into a bigger sea? Does it open into just like a smaller, more sheltered area? And all of those would have impacts on what's going on. But we can leave it sort of blank for now. And I like the idea that whatever this sea is in the middle, there's lots of these twists and turns. There's lots of land. There's more land here than in the Aegean proper. We might come back and change this quite a lot. But I think that it's interesting to just have lots of these small divisible land areas where we can put sort of natural borders in. And that will help explain why we have such a patchwork of kingdoms. There's just lots of natural barriers where people could to set up borders. So let's go there. All right, so we do that, and that creates our land. Now with this parchment effect, it's actually hard to tell, like, this could be our land in the middle. It's not what I was shooting for. To me, the land should be what's out around. And I haven't worked with this map style before, so I'm not sure about that. Because I don't know how to make the interior portion clearly. Well, I guess it'll be land when I start drawing like mountains and stuff. What do you guys think? Get some people in chat. You know, how are we liking that coastline and that map style? Because we could always switch. We could go back to some other map styles. I have the 13th age map style, the Mike Shea. So like your standard WotC, Forgotten Realms map style, basically. I've got his map style in black and white, which we could also do. Or there's this parchment thing, and the coastline. Those in chat, you can pipe up, give me a yay, nay, thumbs up, thumbs down. It's easy enough at this point to like just redraw a new coastline, and it'll definitely end up looking quite different. And definitely some islands would be going in here too. I worry a little bit that maybe where I've made water is going to end up being too small to host a lot of islands, particularly any islands of significant size. You know, because if we start... Ugh, that's gross. You can zoom in. we start doing things like that for all those small islands, you often end up with off those like rocky points. In comparison, so yeah, Max, in comparison to the real world, the total frame that we should see here, when this is all zoomed out, the total frame here is roughly equivalent to the Aegean Sea. So, you know, if you're thinking basically centered on the middle of the Aegean with Greece on like the west side, the sort of coast and part of Turkey on the east, you know, all the islands of the Aegean, that would be what we were looking at. So here right now, I think we've got distinctly more land, implied at least, because of a different distribution. Because, you know, this clearly looks like, you know, a relatively small inland sea and sort of like a lot of land over here, at least on the left, compared to say like Greece, right? Where we've got the Peloponnese and we've got like mainland Greece, which would occupy a lot less. They'd sort of just be this upper quarter or so of the map. So right now we've definitely got more land than in the Aegean. And so the other thing to take into mind there is if we want this place to be relatively sheltered in terms of, you know, you don't have to worry so much off the bat with travelers from outside and trade, and you want to keep everything kind of focused. It's nice to have obvious ways to do that. And so here our only options would be to imply probably that here on the west and like curving around in the south are a lot of like heavy mountains. We could, you know that maybe down here on the southern portion could be something like a peninsula. So maybe it narrows again, and maybe that doesn't extend very far. But right now our map doesn't show that clearly. Yeah, the contrast is, I think, the thing there that I'm thinking about, Jonathan. So red hand roleplay in chat. There probably is ways to contrast that later. We would obviously see when I start placing things like mountains, for instance. You know, if I start placing mountains on the map, then, you know, we can sort of pretty easily see where land is. And yeah, islands are going to be good for like lots of these little independent subcultures and sub ethnicities, and in particular like bigger islands, not just like a lot of small ones. So I think I'm not super happy with that map. So let's do a new one. Sure, save changes. Overland map. Ancient Realms is pretty good. Mike J. Let's do. Yeah, let's do Ancient Realms. And again, 1,000 by 800 miles. This one does have water. Just save over the old one. All right, so here, yeah, you'll see that we've got water going on, like obvious water. Yeah, exactly. So, Jonathan was saying in chat, of course, if geography is like the Aegean, it's just very mountainous in general and hard to traverse. Exactly, and that's what I'm going for. And, you know, often we'll have some of those mountains kind of more heavily placed on the fringes in particular that form sort of natural geographic boundaries, which is good. And I think just the last map, there was just too much implied land, not necessarily actual land, but too much implied land to have to deal with. So let's try a different coastline here. I still like to have, you know, big land up in this upper corner. can hit tab. Oh, shoot. Didn't need to do that. Oh, it's a shame too, because I was actually liking that coast. Alright, we'll do this time. And we'll see how this works after, is I'm going to do it more in pieces. So yeah, Max asks, will you mark areas to show where the plates would affect topography and how currents would affect the shorelines? No. So this will be pretty much too small of a region to be its own like tectonic plate. It might have some plate boundaries that go through it potentially, especially if there's big mountainous area. And you can do that. So when like we're designing our maps and worlds, you kind of have a couple of options, right? Is you could go really bottom up and try and design sort of the underlying issues and then sort of build up what those imply on top. Or you can sort of just like free design it. And you do and should have a good idea of like how geography works in general, right? Like, how mountain ranges are going to look and form and the kind of shapes they could possibly, take. And then let those kind of imply some of those deeper things. And then like in terms of currents, we could definitely put that on here, and that would be a layer that we could add, like what are the prevailing winds, prevailing currents, like things like that. Those are much deeper than I've typically gone into, but I think those are good ideas for sure. But like plate boundaries, they'll sort of just be implied by, kind of what we end up seeing, sort of, like the real world. We see what's left and then we can infer sort of what caused it. And at this point in time, they might not know. We would know, of course. One of the other ways to develop these types of worlds, and I've tried this in the past, is use something like fractal terrain to generate random terrain and then build on top of it. And some of those have pretty elaborate models where you include things like rainfall, so you get erosion patterns and you get rivers placed based on the actual gradients due to erosion. And it's pretty cool, but then it can be kind of hard to work with as well. So here, I think we're going to do this more where we have some implied land. And it might be possible that, these bigger pieces of land that go off the map, it is always possible that these are actually just really large islands. But remember, I mean, we're talking about a pretty huge landmass. So I think those would be islands like even bigger than the UK. Crap. I guess I forgot it's space that just goes back one. Tab deletes that whole thing. Really want to delete just to delete the previous node. It's okay. And basically when I make mistakes and get to making something new in Campaign Cartographer, I don't even bother trying to recreate the shape that maybe I had before, because I found that it's usually impossible. I don't like how that shape is looking. yeah, so Jonathan brings up plates again, sort of fault lines, volcanic activity, potentially covering ancient cities. And yeah, that would be something. And I think usually, I guess my approach with this is I kind of make the shapes that I like and, start placing mountains in places that I like aesthetically, right? Because I'm trying to make a map that looks different, but still looks like it could be a map of the world, right? Like it has familiar things to it. And, I want it to be aesthetically pleasing in terms of its layout. Um, which sometimes, I mean, you could pick a random map of anywhere in the world and it may or may not be aesthetically pleasing depending on the scale you're looking at. And then I'll like start bringing stuff in. And I'll sort of let what I end up with in terms of the aesthetics, which I am keeping in mind. Like I said, like I can't have it's really hard to have mountains that meet at like mountain ranges that meet at like right angles, right? That pretty much just doesn't happen. I don't think it's impossible, but it's incredibly difficult. The mountains that surround Mordor, basically, in Lord of the Rings, I don't think could ever form naturally. And so, like, I'll keep that kind of thing in mind when I'm designing. And then I'll just let that imply that, oh, yeah, there's is or was a plate boundary here and a fault lines. And would it make sense to throw in some, a volcano or something? And, you can also get like the random volcanoes as well that appear sort of in random places, not strictly on the fault lines. So yeah, for sure. And yeah, I like the idea of having mountains or sorry, volcanoes potentially, or one that has erupted and buried an ancient city. So you got like a Pompeii situation or something. Yeah. Let's do. Not liking that. All right, so we've got some more land down there. And so again, because it's just sort of aesthetic, just kind of developed. This map has kind of ended up being divided into thirds. So I'm going to continue with that. All right, I tried to make that one simple, but then it ended up looking like the coastline was too simple given how the other two looked. Didn't have enough, inlets and bays and rough parts. I also like that there's many places where the coasts of these larger land masses get close together. So those are always going to be good conflict zones. All right, that's not bad. How much would magic influence this landscape? All max D20 max. One of my players asks. Good question. I usually make magic impact landscapes sparingly but dramatically. So, because it implies a certain level of magic in the world, either extant or, in the past, that was capable of, shaping large areas of the landscape. It could be more isolated, and isolated things are easy, right? So, there's a ancient column in the middle of the wilderness and it emanates a bit of magic which influences the land around it, but maybe only out to like a few hundred meters or maybe a kilometer or something like that. And so that's more limited. And I think that can be more prevalent, and that's like easy things to bring into play, and it can be really fun to drop those in and discover them. Or you can imagine if there are things like dragons that in like D&D have like layers and influence, the landscape out to miles around them, that you could have that sort of thing. I tend to shy away from that a little bit. But, you can have things like, for instance, the Blasted Lands in Weirun, where there was a large magical disaster that really altered the landscape for, like 100 square miles or something like that. And so those are possible. And, you can have all kinds of things. You can have mountain ranges thrown up that were actually the result of some large impact in the distant past. And maybe that had to do with magic, like someone shattered the moon or pulled it down. And so that's all possible. If something really inspires me, then I do that. Often when I'm making maps, sometimes, and I've done this in the past, sometimes I like particular types of geographic features that you don't often see naturally. Like, I don't know, a bit of coastline that has like a perfect circle, like a perfectly circular rim. And that really implies things like impact craters. And so was that a natural thing that happened in the past, or is it the result of some magical accident or a magical event? And so often I'll just create it initially, and I'll let it kind of, percolate a bit and see if I'm inspired to come up with a story around it. And maybe I leave it for a while and stories come up naturally, like a player asks, like, hey, this place looks weird. What happened here? Suddenly create something. Here, I think that the landscape is mostly natural. I don't think there's been any large magical events that have really shaped the landscape of this place. So, we have some obvious places where we can start, filling out islands, various sizes on the map. And often these points that we get on some of the fractal edges are good places to put islands or chains of small islands together, because the landscape kind of does tend to naturally do that in reality. And then, like when you zoom out, it just gives like some interesting little detail. These are all the islands that are close to the coast. I think that we need some bigger islands, right? If we want that Aegean feel, then we need some larger islands. I'm feeling kind of inspired to put something almost like a large barrier island here. Crescent shaped. Sort of follows the general curve of that coastline there. So for instance, that could have been something, like a large low-lying area that as seawater rises, it got flooded, separated out at one time. I think we need some relatively large islands here. Kind of want them in a cluster, because again, we kind of got this tripartite motif happening, right? Where we've got these three large land masses in sort of, opposing, not quadrants, tridents, whatever, opposing thirds of the map. And, they're sort of pointed into this middle area. And if I put a group of islands here, now I could do 3, right? Oh, that one looks like garbage. Let's delete that. I'm gonna put another one in here. I just didn't like some of the points on that. So, we could do 3 here, right? That would kind of mirror that triplet iconography a little bit. But that might be too heavy-handed, right? Where we've got like an island kind of close to each of their respective, main land masses. So that might be a little too heavy-handed. So I'm definitely going to make it, we got some minor islands. And I like that these are all clustered together. Because again, this goes back to Max's point. You could, these island things that look like they're shattered, if I had done something like a nice circular ring here in the middle, that could be quite evocative of, implying something like island shattered by some impact. And I could still do that, right? I do have sort of, a space here where that kind of thing could be true. But either way, I think that this group of islands of varying sizes, all close together like this, I can already see how these are contested, and B, that they might have a lot of mythology and legend built around them. And, they need a name like the sisters or the siblings. And there should be some city here in the middle of it, probably somewhere that gets fought over all the time. And we might, change these islands around. And again, there's kind of this like curved pattern that you can see. The eye likes to see those patterns. So that could be something going on there. But definitely that's going to be a center point of conflict. And that littler island right in the middle has to mean something, right? Like, look, the eye's just drawn there, right? The center of the map. And I didn't go in planning that design-wise, but it sort of feels right. But now I do still want other islands, including ones of significant size. Out here. So this is already starting to get built up quite a lot. Delphi or Adelphi is sister in Greek. Yeah, that's awesome, Jonathan. And yeah, that's often something I will do with languages, is take a real language and use it at least as the base. Often monkey with it at least a little bit, so it's not, too obviously, in this case, Greek or Latin. So like, often just swap some letters or things like that. I've never totally gotten into conlanguing and like building a real constructed language, so I usually riff off of existing ones. And I think here I'm going to use a lot of Greek and Latin, or we'll call it like pseudo Greek and pseudo Latin. Because we'll monkey with stuff, but it'll definitely have that feel. So I like that. Yeah, like the Adelphis, as like the sisters, or it could be like the siblings. I do tend to like the evocativeness of it being sort of the feminine as opposed to the masculine, like the brothers. But having something like the siblings might make sense. Where we've got these triples, we could, maybe have some interesting things to do with, in the mythology of this place, gender, familial relationships, right? So maybe there's a pantheon of deities, and perhaps there's something like 3 siblings or multiple siblings or something, and all of the, let's say, the tribes, for lack of a better word, of humans, or what passes for humans in this world, have ties to those deities, and it's a kind of fractious family. So there's lots of infighting in the mythology. Maybe there was 3 main patrons, right? These main land masses, the siblings. Or maybe there's, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, major, or 7. 7's always nice, right? If we include this little one, but not the other minor ones, 7's could be something important in the mythology. So maybe there's like 7 siblings, and each of these islands is named for one of them, and each of the tribes of man has some relation to them, or maybe to the 6, right? And then we've got like the missing 7th, right? The mythological 7th tribe. And maybe that does or doesn't tie into our non-human race, right? That we could have here. They were exiled. Maybe there's some like mythological tension there. The more I think about it, the more I like that idea. Jonathan, what's Greek for like a word just for sibling? So as opposed to sister, something more just for sibling. And I suppose I could try Google Translate, but I'm sure that you can tell me something more appropriate. Sibling. Of course, this would be modern Greek, which might not be exactly what I want. Well, Adelphos. Amphithalus. Adelphos. Back translation of that. Sibling. Yeah. What's Amphithalus? Oh yeah, it's not going to give me. kin. You said sister, Adelphi, brother, Adelphos. Oh, okay, so sibling. Maybe something like Amphithalus. Let's go back for a minute to here. So we've got the world, heading 1. And I like this as just bullet points for now. We can expand on later. 3 main land masses, names, siblings, a group of theologically and religiously important islands in the center of the blank sea, because we need a name for this. Ooh, and I'm probably butchering my Greek pronunciations. Yeah, siblings, quickly, I know, there was that weird from Google Translate. Paedia for children is actually pretty good, because then that implies something about the parents of those children too. And so for mythology, that's pretty good. We can have, this religious group has a creator, mother, and father, and then we've got the children. The mother and father have probably gone away or something. The children are considered to have created the tribes of man individually. So that could be, or tutored them. I don't know. Yeah. If we have each of the ethnic groups being independently created by deities, even deities in a family, that has some kind of implications that I don't like about where that potentially takes the world, or even just how we view it. Whereas if humans were created like the gods, or maybe by the gods acting together and then they split, something like that. Center of the blank sea, there are 7 major islands. 6 of them are associated with one of the 6 tribes of man. And then we can come up with good pseudo-Greek words and names for each of those tribes. And I can get corrected on if this is even remotely correct, because it could be pseudo-Greek or pseudo-Latin. I think that was pseudo-Latin. We probably want to stick with pseudo-Greek. So I forget what the ending of that should be. But anyway, we'll figure that out. We each have 6, and we'll give them good names. All right. So there is a shared religious pantheon. And generally shared culture spread across the 6 tribes. The other thing here, me talking about the 6 tribes, is that does sort of imply these are the only humans. Or this is the limits of the known world. And I'm not sure I want that to be the limits of the known world. And I don't know. We can figure that out. Who humans were created by. And people might have different beliefs, right? I kind of like having fantasy worlds where that it's not necessarily definitively known, or what people think based on religion and mythology isn't necessarily true. Which is, I think, again, a little different than a lot of, D&D, where we sort of assume that the mythology is indistinguishable from history. And I still like having, I like having a fantasy world where those blend a bit more than they do in the real world. We can't just dismiss mythology out of hand. But I like there being at least a bit of a fuzzy separation there. But yeah, so generally across here, generally shared religious pantheon, generally shared culture across 6 tribes of the blank sea. So we'll need a name for that. Again, we can look to Greek for maybe some interesting translations, maybe things to do with families or family units, or center or something. Each of the 6 tribes claims one of the siblings as their main deity, not their creator, but their parent or bird king / queen. Yeah. The nobility of each tribe ruling house of each tribe claims descent from their king / queen. So siblings are somewhere between mythological heroes and deities. So they're somewhere in between there. They're gods, but they were also kind of mortal or something. Like they established the ruling lines of each of these tribes. And then there would be like houses that split out from them. So, I think this is going the direction that there's going to be a lot to do with like families, family relationships, bloodlines. Obviously, things don't stay pure, right? People are going to marry other houses, and there's going to be like mixing and matching. And I think there's going to be a lot of historical back and forth as different groups came to dominate others, right? Because we've still got this like short-lived confederacies and things like that. So I think there's going to be expansions and movement. The tribes will mix. They're not going to stay as completely independent. But usually a person will claim, sort of their primary tribe. And the nobles for sure will have like extensive genealogies. Nobles have extensive genealogies that always trace them back to their genitor deity. And like always, I always screw up deity. All right. All right, so we've got a few things there. Right. Let's see. Some of the stuff in the world could have easily gone back up here into principles, but it's okay. It's kind of just getting the ideas down. Mix and match. Seventh tribe. Seventh tribe was exiled. This is the non-human. I put that in quotes. Human group that has been pushed to the fringes of society. I don't know, that's going to breed a lot of racism. I like to kind of keep that out. Let's see. Seventh tribe. And still, they were exiled. Let's keep it at left after some mythological conflict. There are prophecies about their return. No one knows what happened to them. They left on boats long ago. Mythological past. Alright, because that'll give us something to work with later on. There is a non-human species that lives in the region, mostly confined to the mountains, both on the interior, the islands, interior, main land masses, mountains on the fringes of the quote known world, and in scattered pockets elsewhere. These people known as people mountains. I'm going to call them the Torva, is their sort of official name, which means people of the mountains. In their own tongue. All right. So So we have, this is going to be repeating a few things. We definitely have creator, mother and father as creators of the world and of humans. Let's go with all life on it. These parents had 7 children. These 7 children once got along, but something caused conflict. Each of the 7 children formed founded one of the 7 great houses. Each lead one of the 7 tribes of man. Although we can't use that because I'm pretty sure that's in A Song of Ice and Fire, right? I think there's 7. I think they use that as an oath by the 7. We could always change the number here, right? Because we could, add some islands in that map easily enough, or take some away. 7 is always an evocative number, but again, I mean, that's mythologically. We did have triples, so there were some things of 3, so it might make sense to go with like 9, right? And work that out. That's always possible. All right, well, there's a foundation here anyway. And we've got the start, the beginning of a map. And so this is coming along. I think, I've got a lot of ideas in my head. But maybe I should do one more brief section. Sorcery/magic. Yeah, an Ennead, that's right. Yeah, the Sept is in Game of Thrones. Because it's the faith of the 7, and so the religious building is called a Sept, and so there's a lot of playing off of 7 there. 7 appears a lot in mythology, and so yeah, I think we should go with 9. And yeah, the Ennead is a group of 9. Let me just get some thoughts down here on magic. Okay, magic is generally referred to as sorcery in the world. That's just a preference of mine. I always just like the word sorcery better than magic, and sorcerer better than mage. And, again, this isn't, I'm not thinking from a D&D perspective. So I'm not thinking of needing to have sorcerers versus wizards versus warlocks, blah, blah, blah. And of course, some of those will just be names for all the same things, right? People will call people warlocks or wizard. But probably wizard is a word that doesn't get used, or mage, but sorcerer and warlock probably both do. But warlock and witch will probably refer to more, esoteric, eldritch type practices, whereas sorcery is an art. Sorcery is a high art. Actually, it is the high art, the high science, the high philosophy. Those who wield sorcery wield the power of creation itself. The religious consider this blasphemy. And again, this isn't, we always steal, right? This isn't unique. Most sorcerers belong to a school. Maybe I won't use school because that's Baker has his schools, and I'm already riding close enough to some of his with this because sorcery and its terminology is very steeped in the language of philosophy, particularly metaphysics. So in a way, sorcery is metaphysics, as opposed to just the philosophy of metaphysics, because sorcery is the language of creation, and so you are literally rewriting reality when you use magic. School. I'm just going to put school there. Need a different term. Have ranks based on their learning and knowledge and power. Some combination of those. Let's see. Small vocab list, biblical Greek course. You can find sibling. Technon is another word for children, though. Ooh, the technon. That's pretty cool. And Ennead for a group of 9. 2, 3, 6, 7. We just need 2 other big ones. We want to go with 9 here. Might have to redraw that, but let's go up here. 7. I'm going to call it the Ennead. I don't know if I can call it the Ennead versus a Ennead, but we'll see. Group of myths in the center. Or the Enneads, I guess it could be. Well, let's just call the 9. Nine. 8 of them associated with one of the remaining 8 tribes of man. The 9th tribe is missing. Across the 8 tribes. Each of the 8 tribes they are also associated with one of the 9 siblings of the below. Each of the 8 tribes. Or king, queen. 9. Ninth tribe. Sort of a 9 children. The 9th sibling is also presumably missing along with the 9th tribe. Something had to happen to that god too. Just for info, oh yeah, Technon. Alright, and we've got some stuff about sorcery there. It's really just about the rough, broad strokes at this point, and a few of the details. And I think we're going to leave it there, sort of an hour and a half in, of just coming up with some ideas and fleshing them out, and doing a little mapping. And I think we will come back to this in another day. So thanks particularly to Jonathan and Max for asking some questions and getting involved. I think we got some other folks viewing primarily on someone else's channel where we're hosted. Please come and join in when we do a second one and toss in some ideas and help flesh this out. So probably at some point later in this week, maybe tomorrow night, or if not, probably something like Thursday night, I'm going to come back and do some more and flesh this out a little bit more. I'm going to have to look up some Greek stuff, some vocabulary, and get some ideas for names and naming. We'll come in and we'll name these like 9 siblings, because that will cover the name of the main island, a deity, and a tribe, and a house. The house and so we might need some variations on some of those words, and have to come up with any major associations, or I guess personality traits for each of those 9 deities, or at least the 8. The 9th can always remain mysterious, right? Maybe there's not a lot known, right? Because the 9th and their associated tribe presumably left at some point deep in the mythological past. So this could be something like the Stranger. We could use it as like a dark deity, but maybe not, because it's associated with an actual people that presumably exist. So I don't necessarily want to make them evil, because again, that implies things, right? And then we've got a group of people that are evil or something. So, but there should be some dark deities. Maybe there's other deities besides the siblings. The siblings themselves can also have children. I'll probably keep the mother and father figures as like pretty distant. Mother and father are distant. I think that's the demiurge, right? Demiurge. Created, but are not, this isn't the right word, but substantial deities. They're more like concepts or ideas. And we might have the gods all be kind of distant. So, you know, not things that really come down and interact. We might keep religion a little bit more like the real world, where it's hard to really tell if it's absolutely true. versus just being a mythology. Although I like the idea of having priests that have some kind of power, but maybe priests just use like a sanctioned form of sorcery. Do priests just use a sanctioned type of sorcery? I kind of like that idea, so that might be the case. Anyway, all right. Thanks, everyone. Like I said, particularly Jonathan and Max for asking some nice, insightful questions, giving some advice, some help, some suggestions. And we will be back at some point this week to circle back on this. And I think that will have to definitely be a bit of a naming episode, like really thinking deeply about some of the names of these things, at least coming up with good placeholders. They can always change later on. And so, yeah, thanks.